to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hey there, friends, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm today's host, Kate Stevenson. You can find me on Reddit and Twitter as Sunagainstgold. More importantly, my guest today is Dr. Keagan Brewer. He's here to talk about the controversial topic of atheism in the European Middle Ages. And by controversy, I mean some scholars propose that it was not possible for someone to even be an atheist at all in the Middle Ages. Dr. Brewer is an honorary research associate at the University of Sydney and one of the leaders in the ARC's Center for the History of Emotions. If you're wondering how on earth studying emotions led him to take on the topic of atheism in a field already crawling with religious historians, well, stick around. So, welcome to the Ask Historians community, Keagan.
Hi, it's lovely to be here. I've been a fan of the Ask Historians subreddit for a very long time, and particularly your work, so I'm very excited to be talking to you.
Fortunately for me, we're talking about your work today. So let's get started.
Sure.
The Christian Middle Ages are somewhat known for their religious intolerance. 13th century visionary Mechtild of Magdeburg, she's progressive for assigning Jews to the nice part of hell. And Christian priests in the Middle Ages loved to talk about heresy. They loved it so much that sometimes they seem to have invented heresies and heretical movements altogether. So let's start with, how does one separate different religious beliefs and heresy from atheism?
It's a very good question, and one that goes to the heart of some of the methodological problems that we face in looking at atheism in the European Middle Ages. The term atheism, first of all, is a modern one. It's first attested in English in 1540 in an English translation of a text from Plutarch. And so the English derives from the Greek fairly directly. In Latin, which is the dominant language of medieval Europe, the intellectual language, I should say, there were a variety of terms that they used, which are a lot more general. So heresy being one of those. They also used other terms like infidel. So infideles means people who are unfaithful, literally, or incredules, unbelievers, literally. Now, those terms are extremely broad, and each person who uses them can mean a slightly different thing. So these terms sometimes are used to target Muslims, sometimes Jews. But my central contention in my work is that sometimes it applies to people that we can consider atheists. And by atheism, I mean it in the common parlance sense of people who disbelieve the existence of God or the supernatural realm as a whole, which includes God. So where do you draw the boundaries between heresy and atheism? Let me give you a case. One of the earliest cases, if not the earliest case of major heresy in medieval Europe, was in the early 1000s in northern France. And this group of people, it was alleged they didn't believe in the virgin birth. They did not believe in sort of a creator. One of the chroniclers who wrote about this said that the main problem with them was that they didn't believe in God. I think historians of the Middle Ages have neglected that because there's been this enduring belief that atheism was somehow impossible in the European Middle Ages. I disagree with that. So historiographically, when we look at the historians, there's this big and enduring bias that says that anyone who's a heretic is merely just misinterpreting Christianity in one way or other. But I would like to suggest that there is possibility that when the heretic label is used, it can refer to people we would today call atheists.
So how about, to give us an even clearer idea, you walk us through one of the cases of atheism or atheists that you found in your sources?
Absolutely. So I found about 6 or 7 different cases of particular individuals who make claims that I think are pretty similar to modern atheism. One of them is a so-called wretched man, as he's described. The Latin word is miser, which means like a wretched man, a depraved person, something like that. It's from the Gemma Ecclesiastica by Gerald of Wales. Gerald of Wales is one of the most interesting characters of the Middle Ages. He writes lots of kooky books full of rumors and scandal and all sorts of stuff. His Gemma Ecclesiastica is one of his most unpopular texts. It only survives in a single manuscript. So he just sort of gathers tales and writes them in. Often with his books, Gerald of Wales was constantly adding stuff. So you get these real hodgepodge books. His earliest book, for example, went through 5 different revisions. And so the final product is this real mess of different stories just sort of shoved together. Anyway, in this particular story of the gentleman that I think was an atheist, he was actually a priest and celebrating Mass. So you may think, well, a priest can't be an atheist. It's a precursor of being a priest. The precondition is that you have to believe in God. But the priest's superior actually observes the man performing Mass less devoutly and less reverently than he should have. So the man's sort of differences of belief were observable on the face and in body language to the priest's superior. So the superior priest, and neither of them are named in the account, and nor is a location given. They take him, the superior priest takes the junior one aside and sort of confronts him about this. And there's some increasingly heated nagging. And then the wretched priest bursts out, and I'll quote this. "What is this you say? You and your religion are both deserving of hatred. Do you think that this bread becomes flesh or this wine becomes blood? Do you think that God, the creator of all things, took the flesh of a woman, or that he consented to suffer? Do you think that a virgin can conceive without intercourse or remain a virgin after giving birth? Do you think that our bodies will rise again after they have returned to dust? Everything we do is all hypocrisy. The ancients invented such things, no doubt, to strike terror into men and to restrain them from rash deeds." So that's a direct quotation from the wretched priest, allegedly. So the problem there is there are a few varieties of problems. First of all, he seems to reject Christianity as a whole. And that claim at the end that religion was invented to strike terror into people and therefore control them is actually, I think, a key argument that runs through atheist polemic across different societies in different time periods. So that's really interesting. The fact that he has to be pressed into making that outburst suggests that he was hiding his faith. But he also refers to God in the complaints themselves. So there's all sorts of caveats that we should potentially look at there. But I think it's possible that he was stewing in his hidden atheism, and that had emotional consequences.
What does it take for a priest to be noted? This might be unanswerable. What does it take for a priest to be noted as not performing Mass with utmost devoutness? Because there are some pretty interesting stories about this.
Well, that's a very good question. I think the vast majority of disbelievers in medieval texts are people who, according to the people accusing them, were doing the Mass with insufficient reverence or something like that. We can't think of all of those people as atheists, but I would like to suggest that there was a small slice of people who were disbelievers, who were atheists, who had a fairly firm view that there was no God. And that, I think, makes people quite isolated. So they would potentially stew inside their thoughts, which shows up emotionally in terms of emotions like anger, despair, frustration, and stuff like that. The emotions of these people makes the fact that they are pretending faith clear to me, at least.
So could you tell us just really quickly, why would someone who doesn't believe in God, who doesn't believe in the Eucharist, become a priest anyway?
That's an excellent question. There are a variety of reasons. The first is to do with what the priesthood offered to people. Medieval society was, compared to our own society, what we now know. I mean, we're talking on the internet here. We've got fridges and all these sorts of luxuries. Medieval Europe was poor in a lot of regards. So the church offered power, it offered wealth, and it offered status. And many people would gladly kind of hide their true beliefs to pursue that. There is one case of a bishop. His name was Gregory the Roman. He died in the 1230s, and one chronicler, writing about 50 years later, which is a problem, he records this man as refusing the Eucharist upon death. So in Catholic Christianity, you're supposed to accept the viaticum, which is this sort of death ritual which will assist you to go to heaven, and the priest will come and give you blessings and offer you the Eucharist and so on and so forth. But the bishop refused it on his deathbed. And he said that he believes nothing of such a faith, and that's a quote. And then the priests ask him, why would he become a bishop if he didn't believe anything of such a faith? And he says, quite literally, for the money and for the honors, for the status.
One of the things about that particular case that you mentioned, and you got into it a little bit talking about Gerald of Wales, medieval sources, they're often, or almost all of the time, unreliable, just as straight up recitations of actual events. So could you talk a little bit about why we could trust either that particular example, or maybe even better, walk us through another case while discussing the textual concerns along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is probably the key concern. Medieval texts are not good witnesses to people's private beliefs for a variety of reasons. There's a category of texts that some people call ego documents, which is from the private individual's perspective. When you look at a World War I diary, for example, you're looking at the soldiers' key concerns, I guess, and there's no sort of mediation, or not as much, or there's no sort of biasing in the text. So we can assume, I think more so with that sort of text, that it's reliable than with the medieval one. The text from Gerald of Wales that I was talking about is actually a collection of stories designed for the Welsh priesthood. Gerald believed that they were not doing so well in terms of the way they were practicing their faith at that particular moment. So he's giving stories designed to encourage people to, I guess, be better priests and be a better Christian flock. In that framing, the story he told is didactic. In other words, it's got the firm purpose of teaching, this is what happens. Look at this person with these bad views, and, this sort of evil is everywhere, he says. In fact, after he tells that story of the wretched priest, he exclaims in frustration, "Oh, how many similar people are there like this around everywhere?" Which is an excellent question. But I actually want to talk about a different text and a different case. So there's a case where we're now in sort of France in the early 1300s, and we're talking about inquisitions now. So there's the famous Inquisition register of a guy called Jacques Fournier, and he's one of the major inquisitors of the early 1300s. So we're jumping around a lot in time, which is interesting too. So in this particular case, he's in a small village, and he's interrogating a couple of people. The first one her name is Guillemette d'Ornolac. She said that she believed in God, but she did not believe in the soul. She did not believe in resurrection or heaven or hell or any world but the present. So she believes that the world was permanent and there's sort of no supernatural, but there is a God, she allegedly says. She says that she returned to an orthodox opinion on the nature of the soul because, and I quote, "I heard tell that my lord, the Bishop of Pamiers, wished to carry out an investigation against me about it. I was afraid of my Lord Bishop after that, and I changed my opinion after that time." So under pressure, she backs off from her view that there is no soul, or at least she says that to the Inquisition. And then that's what's recorded in the Inquisition register. So when a person is put under pressure in a formal situation like that, their views that they express may not be reliable. And the same problem occurs in modern legal cases. We think of court records as extremely reliable evidence for what a person says, but the emotional pressures that they face may lead them to lie. And we know that there are cases where people in criminal courts have lied and then backtracked later on. Now, that would only get recorded in an Inquisition register as the initial lie under pressure. So that's really interesting. A second case from the same Inquisition register is a woman named Aude de Merviel. She was ill. She told her husband that she did not believe in God. There's an association there between suffering and complaint about faith, which is another issue we could talk about. The husband then basically tells her off in really strong words. He says, "What, damned woman? Are you saying this in your right mind?" That's a quote from the Inquisition register. She responds, "Yes," and then he threatens her with expulsion from the house. She then sends for a friend who testified that she was extremely afraid to talk about this issue. The friend's testimony says, "When I arrived near her, she asked me if there was anyone else in the room. I told her there was not. She told me then that she wanted to confess something to me. How can it be that I cannot believe in God and the Eucharist, she said. The friend testified that she was terrified, and then she called the woman Ord a heretic and a traitor. I told her to believe strongly, otherwise she would be lost, she says. Then the friend becomes sick also, so we can infer that it was perhaps some sort of infectious disease that the lady was facing. And the friend says that her illness comes from Ord's atheistic beliefs. So it's really interesting. The Inquisition register there is itself a kind of pressure on the people speaking. They may or may not be telling the truth. And so that's a problem for our texts. Even the texts that we might consider extremely reliable, like an Inquisition register, they have their own problems.
You mentioned that jumping around in time is interesting. You're not going to get away with that without saying more.
Sure. Okay. So we think of the Middle Ages as this sort of single monolithic thing, but in fact, it's huge. The period that I looked at is roughly 1000 to 1350. So that's 350 years. And in all of that, I found about maybe 7 cases that are, I think, really, really strong evidence of people being atheists. There's plenty of evidence for general complaints about disbelief or heresy and so on and so forth. There's a lot more evidence for that than what I've found for particular atheists. So there's a problem with that. So if I jump from 1017 in France to 1317 in France, that's 300 years. We can look at them all and say, oh yeah, okay, there was plenty of atheism in the Middle Ages. But I think the rarity of the records is itself really interesting. And also the rarity of the cases of firm atheism in the Middle Ages means that to the churchmen, atheism itself is rare and furtive, and therefore it contributes to their sense that atheism is evil and this kind of underground thing that needs to be expunged. So I think we have to be careful with revising our perceptions of the Middle Ages. We can't say that it's an age of atheism, I think. That would be exaggerating the evidence. But I don't think we can say it's an age of zero atheism either.
So essentially, atheism wasn't a big enough problem for priests and friars to write too much about it, but it was enough of a problem that there's not that much written about it.
I think that there is a lot of anti-atheist polemic from medieval churchmen, and that can add to our sense that it was there, bubbling away beneath the surface, even if the particular individuals, like individual stories, are hard to find. Certainly there's no person in the Middle Ages who appears to have stood up with pride and said, yes, I'm an atheist and I'm going to write books about it, and I'm going to publicize my thoughts and proselytize atheism. There's no medieval Richard Dawkins, and there's a variety of reasons for that. So the first is that writing is largely restricted to the church. Writing materials in the time were very expensive, hard to come by, and required a lot of processing. Medieval manuscripts were expensive, rare, and difficult to access. Writing itself requires lots of years of study, which generally happened in the church, in church schools. So that's a factor. Another thing, going back a point there was plenty of anti-atheist polemic. So often that appears in sermons. There's a lot of scapegoating of atheists when bad things happen. But I want to talk about one particular text, which I think is really interesting. So the text is a book of visions by a gentleman called Peter of Cornwall. He was the prior of the Holy Trinity Church in London. He wrote an entire book of visions around the year 1200. And the reason that he wrote that is because, quote, there are some who think that God does not exist and reckon that the world has always been as it is now and ruled by chance rather than by the providence of God, end quote. So he writes his entire book, he says, to combat atheism. And I don't think we can accuse him of just being rhetorical here. Many scholars out there in our field think that when a comment like that comes up, we shouldn't necessarily believe it because it's just a thing that people say. However, Peter launches into a wide-ranging set of arguments that go against a variety of things. And it actually helps us understand what the key threats to Christian belief were at the time. So Peter argues that anyone who disbelieves angels, heaven, or God, even though they have not seen them, are kind of locked in a prison. And so he uses some arguments by analogy. He says that Adam could see God and paradise and angels, but anyone born after the fall must live by faith. So if there was a young boy born in a dungeon and his mother told him about the sun and the moon and the stars and birds and flowers and mountains, then the boy would not be following good logic to disbelieve in those things. So that's his analogy for Christian belief. He says that unbelievers do have faith, but just not in God. So an unbeliever, for example, knows who his parents are, or his or her parents are, even though that person has not seen their own birth. So he's using all sorts of arguments along those lines. An unbeliever knows that Asia and Africa and Jerusalem exist, even though they have not seen those. So therefore, we should have more faith in God. This argumentation goes for many, many pages in this book. So I find it really interesting that there are those texts like that. And I think that they can add to our sense that there were real living, breathing atheists in medieval Europe.
So if there is, and you make a persuasive case in your article, in your forthcoming article, you have all of this evidence for atheism and for anti-atheist proselytizing that goes way beyond the biblical, the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. Why has this been so controversial among scholars?
It's a very good question. I think there was a writer in the 20th century who was widely read and very well known, Lucien Febvre, and he writes a famous book about the beliefs of Rabelais. And his claim is that atheism could not have existed before the 1600s. And the reason for that is, I think, kind of vague. His argument is that the church controls every aspect of life and is just sort of interfused with everything in the Middle Ages. And I don't necessarily reject that. I think the Middle Ages was predominantly an age of faith, as the old stereotype goes. But beneath that surface there are people who think differently. There are no good reasons, in my opinion, why a person in the year 1200 cannot think of possibly being an atheist, or cannot feel like they want to reject everything that the church stands for, or the beliefs that the church holds, such as belief in God. There are no structural reasons in medieval society why that's impossible. But I think there has been that sense in our field that it is impossible, that there were no atheists, there's no evidence of it, so therefore it was impossible. And I just think that that's quite reductive, and it doesn't reflect the truth in the sources that I have seen. If you are, say, a person in the Middle Ages who has the thought, I do not believe in God, first of all, to call yourself an atheist, I think, requires some axes of conviction and time. So how deeply do you believe there is no God? Or is that just a little thing that happens in your head very briefly and then you pass over it? And time, how long have you held that belief for? So I think the emotional mechanisms in medieval society were such that everybody knew that saying there is no God is a bad thing. Going back to that case of the woman and her husband who threatens to throw her out of the house, she was stressed and sick and crying before she even made the comment. She knew that it wouldn't be well received. And then after her friend tells her a story of a disbeliever who gets punished by going to hell, she's breaking down in tears. All of those emotional mechanisms are preventing atheists from talking. And so that has influenced our sources. It's only very, very rare evidence that comes through that there are people like that. So I think possibly, although we can never know this for certain, there were more than the texts actually reflect.
In some of the cases where we can see modern scholars not recognizing the possibility of atheism, the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. I've heard arguments where that doesn't actually apply to no God, but some form of God's intervention in the world or things along those lines. Do you think the way people have interpreted or not interpreted the text that you specifically are focusing on, or the effort to reframe the use of verses like that, is this just overlooking the possibility of atheism, or do you see this as an active repression and a mission to say, hey, Age of Faith is complete and blanket?
So I would say that scholars are not necessarily actively repressing the idea of atheism in medieval society. I don't think anybody out there, whether they're a scholar from a Christian background or an atheist background, is trying to do that in their heart of hearts. I think that the idea that there was no atheism in medieval Europe is deeply entrenched. But I also think that many, many scholars are more hesitant than I am about the sources. Let me say, for example, there's an example from a book by Caesarius of Heisterbach about a young girl. She is in training to be a nun, and she is praying in solitude, and she gets quite stressed because of that and pretty depressed. So the author, Caesarius of Heisterbach, is writing this tale to show that this unbeliever gets taught the right way by God because she receives a vision. So he gives her the label tristitia, which is kind of like an equivalent for depression in today's language. So the girl's isolated, she's depressed, she's praying a lot, but she finds herself wasting away, and her body is skinny, and she's very unhappy. She approaches the abbot, who says that, he reminds her that she's praying for God, and she needs to respect that. And so he commands her to cross herself. And then she basically bursts out and she says, no, why do I have to pray for a God who says that there is a God, who has seen these things, who has ever seen angels? Why should I believe these things? And the abbot is extremely shocked, and he locks her up for, quote, at least a week. It's unclear whether she had any food during that week. So I suspect, although I cannot prove it, that she was facing starvation issues. So she received a vision, and the vision was of a soul, allegedly. And its form was spherical, and it looked like a globe of light. And then on the basis of that vision, she sort of comes back to her original beliefs, her faith. And so Caesarius presents this as a tale where there's a divine vision that is fixing an unbeliever. So I think most scholars, in looking at that text, and this is one that has been known for some time and discussed by a variety of scholars, most people would say that's not a real atheist because she was just isolated, she was just feeling depressed, so she didn't necessarily have a firm and avowed view of atheism. Now, I would look at it differently. I would rather have the discussion. I don't think we can just sort of dismiss and push away her views there simply because she was stressed. That's how, in fact, most of the atheists that I think are reasonable candidates for atheism appear in the text. So I think I'm a bit more headstrong in suggesting that this is a possibility for medieval society, whereas the tendency has been to downplay and sort of dismiss because there is that widespread assumption that the Middle Ages is an age of faith.
Well, headstrong has historically been what medievalists are best at. So you can just fit right in with that. You mentioned that at least the text says that she's starving. She's not text says, but the text insinuates that she's starving for a week. And this lines up right with things usually didn't go so well for people labeled heretics in the Middle Ages. I know from my other research that they went even worse for people in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Is this bad treatment? We have textual bad treatment, but is this more historical or behavioral bad treatment a pattern?
I think so, yes. And I think that the history of the emotions allows us to observe that. Now, the history of the emotions is a field that kind of has taken off, I think, over the last 20 years or so. The basic premise in the original form of the history of the emotions was to show that emotions are different in historical societies. There were many scientists some time ago who believed that the emotions were universal because they're biological. For example, when I feel love, I get all of those positive, happy chemicals pumping through my brain and so on and so forth. And that was the same for medieval people as for ancient people, and so on and so forth. That being said, and I would agree with those points, the brain is shaped by culture. So the things that I love may be different to the things that a medieval person loves. The causes and effects of love, or the way we think about love, could have been very, very different. So on that basis, there was some huge movements in the humanities to look at the emotions of past people and how they're different and how they're similar. So on the back of that, I tried to look closely at some of these people I think are potential candidates for atheism and see what's happening with the emotions. So my hypothesis is that if a person was hiding their true atheistic thoughts, then that leads them to feel sort of isolated and perhaps even depressive. We see that in the young girl, the story of the young nun that I've just mentioned. And then in normal times, in times of regular emotion, they will sort of maintain that facade of piety. And then in times of heightened emotion, they may burst out from their core views that they have been hiding. The problem with that is that people in moments of anger can say lots of different things. But I think we're better off giving them the benefit of the doubt that in moments of intense anger or depression, they are actually bursting out with their true deep-seated beliefs. So that's basically the trend across pretty much all of the sources that I've looked at. I can't think of many counterexamples where a person is in a time of sort of neutral or attenuated emotion talking about their atheistic beliefs. It only seems to burst out when they're angry or depressed.
What about the early case you mentioned with the priest? Does that follow the same pattern?
Absolutely. So the priest was performing the rite of the mass with insufficient devotion, according to his religious superior. And so he only bursts out with his views when they're in private, and he's getting nagged pretty persistently and with increasing heat, as the case describes it. It's only then that he sort of bursts out. So people could essentially hide their beliefs and then burst out only in moments of strong emotion. And I think that's really important. And there are actually, and this is a completely different tangent that I won't go into, there are actually similarities around that and atheism in other historical societies like ancient Greece. So if you want to read more about that, I'm looking at a really interesting and well-written book called Battling the Gods by Tim Whitmarsh. So strongly recommend that one.
Do you think the situations of strong emotion that would affect how people, well, you've already mentioned sort of how it would affect modern scholars' views, but how that affected the medieval views of atheists?
Okay. Yes, that's an interesting point. So I think the priests and the writers that respond to these atheistic outbursts tend to brand these people as kind of madmen or something like that. So one of the most complex cases that I've found is a gentleman called Simon of Tournai. He was a professor of theology at the University of Paris in the late 1100s. Something happened. He was known, or he had a reputation for being extremely intelligent, a very precise thinker, but B, a little bit blasphemous. So there's a variety of reports, about 7 or 8. And
a little bit blasphemous.
A little bit blasphemous, to say the least. It's pretty unclear what Simon said. But he burst out at one point with some sort of blasphemous comment that really got everybody talking. This moment appears in texts down to the 1300s, so over 100 years of afterlife for this particular tale. And he said something like, wouldn't it be nice if we could all have a discussion about whether Christianity is good or not? Some of the phrasings put it quite passively. Others have it more aggressively, like, oh, little Jesus, this is all stupid. I'm not quoting directly there, but I'm sort of paraphrasing. But he was a theologian. So the historiographical orthodoxy around his case is that all of those claims were just based on intellectual jealousy because he was extremely smart. And if you look at his books, he has a whole variety of theological works, many of which still remain in manuscript form only, so they're hard to access, and they are very, very particular. But his books have some interesting thoughts about ideas of truth. So one of the things that he talks about is the difference between a theological truth or a religious truth and a scientific truth. So in religion, he says, the belief comes first and then the evidence follows. And then in science, or in Aristotelian thinking, to be more specific, in Aristotle's thinking, the evidence comes first and the belief comes second. I think that's a cognitive precursor to atheism, potentially. And so I think the scholarship has downplayed this incident. They think because he was a theologian, therefore it's not possible for him to have actually been a hidden atheist. I don't think that stands. I would certainly like to reignite the discussion around Simon of Tournai as suggesting that he was legitimately hiding atheistic beliefs. I don't think it was impossible, and we shouldn't think that it was a zero chance.
Are there any significant differences between the many accounts of Simon?
Absolutely. There are a whole variety of differences, including date and location and the claims about him. So the earliest text, which is reasonably contemporary, simply says that he had a stroke because of his theological error. That's the other part of the case that I didn't mention, is that he had a stroke. So after he gave that atheistic outburst, he had some sort of a stroke that rendered him imbecile. He was unable to read. And so the texts that talk about him largely present it as a case of God punishing the bad atheist, which is extremely biased, of course, but it perpetuates the belief in God and those sorts of fearful stories that were adding to people's self-checks on behavior. So if there was no atheism in medieval Europe, I have a question as to why that's the case. And I think that the psychological mechanisms are important. So looking at stories where atheists seem to have been punished can also increase the self-checks on behavior. So he has his stroke. So the earliest text says that he has his stroke, but he had he was in theological error, but it didn't say why. And this is a German source. The second source is about 10 years later-ish, and that's from Gerald of Wales again, our funny collector of gossip. So Gerald of Wales likes to exaggerate and play things up. So Gerald says that Simon was a hidden disbeliever and that he talked to his friends a lot about this, but he never talked to the public about it. And Gerald bemoans that. Whether we should trust Gerald is not clear. So Gerald basically says that Simon was very strongly emotional. He was really angry and that he burst out with his atheistic comment. But Gerald doesn't give a reason as to why he's angry. So there's two possibilities there, in my opinion. The first is that Simon was a hidden atheist and angry at his sort of isolation. The other possibility is that Gerald is deliberately exaggerating the emotions to kind of make Simon look like a madman. You know, here's this raving lunatic. He was full of anger and wild. So he bursts out with this comment. And I guess the underlying assumption of that is that only the most crazy or wild of people would even think, let alone say something along the lines of there is no God.
So accounts like these are more to discredit atheists in the eyes of theologians writing and their readers.
Absolutely. But theologians and their readers then filters through to society. So theologians will send texts to priests. Priests will then read them, talk about them, not necessarily all the time. And it's hard to find exact reception evidence. But we also need to think about the oral transmission of these ideas. What we have with our texts, and there are at least 7 texts, actually 8, I think, for that particular case, they're all just little whispers of the oral world that is really what the history was. So we can't really know who's saying what to whom, but this story has an intense afterlife that goes for a long time. It appears again and again and again. It gets simplified over time, and new layers get added to it. One of the texts, for example, Thomas of Cantimpré, writing about 80 years afterwards, claims that Simon had a female lover by the name of Adelaide. And that's another layer, like adding the concubinage makes Simon look even worse. He's a Christian doctor, a Christian priest, so he's supposed to be morally pure and so on and so forth. So it accrues layers, as legends tend to do, and it gets simplified also, as legends tend to do. So it has an enduring afterlife. And what I'm interested in is not just the writing, but also, and it's only available to the imagination really, what exactly were they saying about him and how widely was it talked about? I think the fact that it appears in so many texts means that it was probably widely discussed, and that's adding a disincentive for atheists to open up. Here's this story of an atheist, and everyone's saying that God punished him with a stroke. Therefore, okay, well, I'd better be careful about what I think and what I believe.
When you say widely discussed, are you talking about just scholars and people who are Latin literate? Or do you mean people listening to a sermon and hearing this particular story as an exemplum, like a story added to the text of the sermon in order to illustrate its points? Are those people hearing this story?
That's a very good point. In the texts that we have, there is at least one sermon. The other texts are of various genres for this particular case. So we know that Gerald of Wales's book did not circulate widely. Nevertheless, he heard about it, so it was being discussed wherever Gerald of Wales was available to hear it. Matthew Paris, who's another one of the chroniclers who describes this source, says he heard it from a bishop, Nicholas of Farnham, who later became Bishop of Durham. So this was something that people were talking about. It was a big moment in medieval society at the time. And the Matthew Paris one, he's writing in the 1240s. So this is around 50 years later. People are still talking about this. The Bishop of Durham, Nicholas of Farnham, claims to have been there when it happened. I think we should doubt that because of the timeframes. But nevertheless, people are talking about it. With regard to the particular question about sermons, one of the texts that we do have is actually an anonymous sermon with this exemplum. And it simplifies the tale. It simply says he was a guy who, was a disbeliever, and he struck with speechlessness and death. So, therefore, don't be a disbeliever. But you can see that with the texts that it did transmit widely. So these tales of atheists are told and retold with the sense that they're good stories for creating fear. And through fear, therefore, atheism will be subdued.
The excerpt, the story you mentioned from Caesarius von Heisterbach, he is writing, little stories that are then really used as exempla in the later Middle Ages. I'm cheating here. Sorry, I know this isn't your era. But these are used for really wide distribution in the vernacular. We don't have any evidence that this particular one was used. But do you find the inclusion of a story in a text like this one particularly significant?
That's a very good question, actually. It's something I haven't thought too much about, simply because, as you say, late Middle Ages is not my particular focus. You actually raise a good point, I think. Possibly the story in Caesarius of Heisterbach had the widest readership because of its afterlife. Of all of the particular cases that I've sort of found or thought about, some of the other ones are more obscure. The tale of the wretched priest that I introduced earlier, for example, survives only in one manuscript. So I think you do raise a good point. That is a trend that happens throughout the 13th century, and then more so in the 14th and 15th century, that these compendia of exemplar, they get bigger, they get wider spread, and so on and so forth. With the rise of literacy across the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, these tales do begin to get told and retold more and more, I think. So if I was to hazard a guess, I would say that the story of Caesarius's adolescent nun has the widest readership of all of the tales that I've looked at.
And I just want to stress for any listeners that the Dialogus Miraculorum, which is Caesarius's text, is really great reading. And that and Gerald of Wales, you should definitely be checking out when you're finished listening to this podcast.
Can I also add that that tale from Caesarius is not the only one that has disbelievers in it. In fact, there was a scholar, Brian Patrick Maguire, who did some really cool statistical work, and he basically found out that I've got the numbers here. He's got 746 miracle narratives, and I think I haven't got the exact number, but a large number of them concern doubters and disbelievers. But I just think that particular case of the adolescent nun is probably the strongest evidence for atheism in particular. Which brings me to another point, actually. One thing that our field has not been very good at is asking whether atheism is possible for people who are labeled disbelievers. So if you've got a text that labels someone infidelis, or an infidel, or unfaithful, unbelieving, we can simply use that term and that's fine. But can we assume that they are not atheists, that they are just people who disbelieve one aspect of the faith, such as the Eucharist? I don't think we can make that assumption, given that, as I have found, there are people out there who claim, or who burst out in anger, claiming that there is no God. I don't think we can rightly assume that someone labeled infidelis is 100% not an atheist.
And I think also the particular story you picked from Caesarius is the most emotional for us as readers today.
Very much so, yeah.
So we've got the history of emotions and the history of atheism or atheists. How did you end up combining these? Were you specifically looking for stories of atheists and then said, hey, whoa, all this emotions? Or was this in the course of some of your history of emotions research, which is what you came in with?
That's a good question. I don't know if it was firmly the one or the other, but maybe a bit of both. During my PhD candidature, I was looking at my project was called Wonder and Skepticism in the Middle Ages. Essentially, I wanted to know if medieval people believed in all these sorts of kooky tales of the supernatural, and if so, why, or if not, why not? So I sort of examined some of the epistemological groundings of all of those. So I was looking at really any stories that pertained to supernatural events or visions, or what we call marvels mirabilia. So in the course of that research, I actually came across some stories, such as the ones we've been discussing. So I saw the Caesarius one, I saw the one about Simon of Tournai. And so I wrote about that a little bit in my PhD thesis, but I've wanted to come back and expand it because I've noticed that nobody sort of in our field talks about the word atheism. There are lots of people out there who are happy to use the term disbelief or unbelief and similar terms, anti-clericalism, so on and so forth. But no one was talking about atheism specifically. And I thought that that was a bit of a shame for a couple of reasons. First of all, it seems to not go with what the people are saying in the text. And second of all, I think the term atheism is more useful now. And given that there is a rise of atheism in modern Western societies, at least, although apparently atheism is on the decline globally, which is interesting. So I guess what I wanted to say is that looking at the emotions of the people, I started looking through wonder at these tales, but then now I've got the atheist idea. I'm looking back at the texts from the perspective of emotion, and I think that the cultural frameworks that are in place are leading people to be isolated if they feel that there is no God is a likely thing. And so that sort of feeling of repression actually discourages them from speaking. And so that's why we get the really strong emotions associated with the people in the texts.
Now that I've put you through the ringer about the history of emotions, I want to switch gears, but this is your fault because you mentioned it earlier.
Go on.
You talked about briefly the connection between suffering and the atheists in your stories suffering and their faith or lack of faith. Now, this is a connection that makes perfect sense to us today. You're suffering and you think, oh, wow, obviously there can't be a God because God wouldn't let me suffer like this. But in the Middle Ages, it was often the opposite. And suffering is especially associated with God and with the Passion of Christ and Jesus on the cross. How do you reconcile those different ideas?
Cool. So I actually want to jump onto a completely different tangent, which is one of my other loves, which is the year 1187. So I've recently published with my colleague James Kane a critical edition and translation of one of the most primary sources for Saladin's invasion of Jerusalem in 1187. So Saladin was a Muslim general who united a lot of the sort of Muslim world of the time against the Crusader states, and he eventually conquered Jerusalem in 1187. Now, in a recent article which is coming out in Medieval Encounters, a journal, I have looked at how Christians from Europe and Christians from the Crusader states and the Near East, how they justified this in theological terms. So let's say, for example, God arranges everything. The Muslims invade Jerusalem, therefore God wanted the Muslims to invade Jerusalem, which is confusing because the Christians believe that they are God's people and that the Muslims are not. So how does that work? So essentially what I've found is that there is beneath the surface a whole variety of different explanations that are sort of bubbling around in the texts. There are some people who believe that there is no God, potentially. There are some people who take that as evidence that the Muslim gods are superior. There are some people who say that the Crusaders are murderers and that we should be trying to convert the Muslims, not attacking them. There are some people who say that, the celestial landscape must be different in some way to what they thought. The dominant explanation of this event is that God is punishing Christian sin. Because there was sin in the Crusader states or sin across all of Christendom, therefore God allowed the Muslims to conquer Jerusalem, even though God doesn't like the Muslims, allegedly. So therefore, the Muslims are kind of like devils that God is using to punish the bad Christians. So that single event, I guess, going back to your question about suffering, the loss of Jerusalem for the Catholic world at the time was an incredible trauma. The loss of the true cross at the Battle of Hattin, the place where Jesus walked, and so on and so forth. So they feel that profound loss. And so the Third Crusade becomes a kind of paroxysm that relates back to the emotions. So it's an incredibly, in my opinion, guilt-ridden worldview to say that anything bad that happens actually is one's own fault because one has been sinful, because everybody has been sinful. And so in mentality terms, confirmation bias comes into play. We interpret the evidence around us and feed it back into providentialism. So that single event is polarizing, basically. Some people use it to strengthen faith and to flagellate and to become more intensely religious and more ascetic, and others use it to suggest alternative celestial modes, maybe that the Muslim gods are better, gods plural, according to contemporary Catholics, and similar things along those lines.
And I think one final question, and once again, this is your fault. A particular, of course, interest of mine is that I am interested in everything. Your scholarly history and future also includes everything.
Uh-huh.
You tell me that one of your scholarly interests is a specific year. That's pretty much a sign of everything else. You do history of emotions,
Yep.
wonder, skepticism, atheism, the Crusades, Crusader texts, and even looking further east and further south at the legend of Prester John.
Mm-hmm.
Does this all fit together, or is it just wow, the Middle Ages are just that cool?
Very good question. I think the Middle Ages is just pretty cool. I want to be passionate about the things that I look at, and I want to look at them exhaustively. But I will sort of jump around to what suits my interests. One thing that I would say that kind of underlines all of my research is the idea of belief and disbelief and the way that they interact with emotions. I'm a big fan of a social psychologist called Jonathan Haidt. One of his main ideas is intuitionism. So basically, he argues that people have emotional intuitions, and then the logic that they follow comes sort of afterwards. It's in line with a lot of those sort of pop psych people, kind of like Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, all those sorts of people. So the basic idea is that we have these fundamental intuitions, which are emotional, really. And then we use logic after the fact to kind of justify those pre-existing intuitions. So belief and disbelief and the way they intersect with emotions is how I would characterize the grand sum of my research. It started off with Prester John because I was interested to know something that apparently no scholars had really gone into very much, which was did medieval Europeans legitimately believe in Prester John or not? And I think after doing my research, I discovered why nobody had talked about it, which is because it's really, really hard to figure out. And there's not much good evidence to support a case for that. But yeah, building upon that from legends through to the supernatural. And I think my future research will look more at the problem of evil in the Crusades, at least for the next year or so. So I'm interested to know how the beliefs about God in medieval Europe interacted with their beliefs about what was actually happening in the Crusades, particularly with relation to the Muslims.
Is there any last words that you want to share with everybody?
I don't think so. I think, yeah, it's been exciting to talk to you. I'm very excited to air the stories of some of these medieval people I've found who I think are reasonable candidates for atheism. I'm hoping that people become a bit more comfortable in thinking about this term as a possible lens for analysis of the Middle Ages. So I think that kind of completes the arc a little bit better with regard to the history of atheism. A lot of the books that currently exist, like the Cambridge History of Atheism or the Cambridge Guide to Atheism, these sorts of books tend to have a chapter on atheism in antiquity and then skip to a chapter on atheism in the modern period. And it's nice to hopefully fill in that gap. And I hope people start thinking about this and taking it a bit more seriously than has been done in the past.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a privilege and a joy to get to talk to you.
I would say the same right back to you. So thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.